In 1987, Forbes magazine declared a Japanese real estate tycoon named Yoshiaki Tsutsumi the richest person on Earth. His personal net worth? A staggering $468 billion in today's dollars, more than Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and the Sultan of Brunei combined. He owned entire mountains, luxury hotels, golf courses, railroads, and ski resorts across Japan. His Seibu Group empire controlled one of Tokyo's most prestigious department stores and one of Japan's most beloved baseball teams. For 30 years, the world believed this was the face of Japan's economic miracle, a self-made billionaire who proved that hard work and shrewd investing could create unlimited wealth. But here's what they didn't know. Almost none of it was real. Behind the Forbes rankings and the global admiration was an elaborate fraud that would make Bernie Madoff look like a street hustler. Yoshiaki Tsutsumi systematically falsified land values, manipulated stock prices, created phantom assets, bribed politicians, and cooked his books for 3 consecutive decades. When prosecutors finally unraveled the scheme in 2005, they discovered something even more shocking than the fraud itself. Tsutsumi's empire wasn't an exception to Japan's economic miracle. It was the perfect symbol of how the entire thing actually worked. Today, you're going to learn exactly how one man fooled the entire world, why nobody stopped him, and what his collapse revealed about the biggest economic lie of the 20th century. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, if you enjoy these kinds of economic mysteries, the financial events that shaped our world while most people weren't paying attention, please hit that like button and subscribe to The Sleeping Economist. Chapter 1. The Prince of Seibu. To understand how Yoshiaki Tsutsumi became the world's greatest economic con artist, you need to understand where he came from and what he inherited. Yoshiaki was born in 1934 to Yasujiro Tsutsumi, a man who practically invented the Japanese real estate empire. Yasujiro wasn't just wealthy. He was ruthless, connected, and brilliant. Starting in the 1920s, he pioneered a business model that would define Japanese capitalism for generations. Buy cheap land near where railroads would be built, then build the railroads yourself. Once your trains connected Tokyo to previously remote areas, develop hotels, resorts, department stores, and golf courses on that land you bought for pennies. Finally, watch the land values explode because you created the infrastructure that made them valuable. Think of it like buying swampland in Florida, building the highway to it yourself, then opening Disney World on that swampland and watching millions of people drive down your highway to visit your resort. By the 1950s, Yasujiro controlled the Seibu Railway system, sprawling hotel chains, and more land than some Japanese prefectures. But Yasujiro had a complicated personal life. He had multiple families with different women, creating a succession nightmare. When he died in 1964, his empire was divided among his sons. Yoshiaki received the Seibu Railway Group, the hotel chains, the ski resorts, and the crown jewel, vast land holdings around Tokyo and throughout Japan's mountain resort areas. His half-brother Seiji received Seibu department stores and the Seibu Lions baseball team. The brothers immediately became rivals, each determined to prove they had received the better inheritance. And this is where Yoshiaki's 3-decade fraud began. From the moment he took control in 1964, Yoshiaki Tsutsumi started inflating the book value of his land holdings. Japanese accounting rules at the time were ... flexible. Companies could value their land at purchase price, current market price, or their own internal estimates. Yoshiaki chose door number 3, and he estimated very, very generously. A mountain resort purchased in 1960 for $50 million? By 1970, it would be listed on Seibu's books at $200 million. By 1980, $800 million. By 1987, $3 billion. And because the land was never sold, nobody could definitively prove the values were wrong. After all, how do you price a mountain? But it wasn't just creative accounting. Yoshiaki bribed land assessors, paid off local politicians to approve zoning changes that inflated values, and created circular transactions where Seibu companies would buy land from each other at inflated prices, generating paper profits but no actual cash. By the mid-1980s, Yoshiaki Tsutsumi's Seibu Group claimed to own land worth over $468 billion. And the world believed every word of it. Chapter 2. Riding the Bubble. The 1980s were an insane time for Japan. After decades of post-war recovery, the Japanese economy was roaring. The Nikkei stock index was hitting record highs monthly. Japanese companies were buying Rockefeller Center, Columbia Pictures, and Pebble Beach Golf Course. American business schools were teaching Japanese management techniques. Everyone agreed Japan would soon overtake America as the world's largest economy. And at the center of this economic miracle was a simple belief: Japanese land values would rise forever. Why? The logic seemed bulletproof. Japan is a small island nation with limited land and a massive population. Tokyo was becoming a global financial center. Demand was infinite. Supply was fixed. Therefore, prices could only go up. Some economists seriously calculated that the land underneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was theoretically worth more than all the real estate in California combined. This wasn't just speculation. It was national economic policy. Japanese banks would lend you 90% of your property's value, and when that property increased in value, they'd lend you 90% of the new value too. You could borrow against your borrowing infinitely, as long as property values kept rising. And they always did, until they didn't. For Yoshiaki Tsutsumi, this environment was perfect. His entire fraud was built on one assumption: that nobody would ever question his land valuations, because everyone agreed Japanese land was priceless. When Forbes called him the world's richest man in 1987, they simply took his land values at face value, multiplied by his ownership percentage, and crowned him king. But Yoshiaki wasn't content to just ride the bubble. He actively pumped it up. Throughout the 1980s, Seibu Group bought more land, developed more resorts, built more hotels, all financed with loans backed by overvalued land. The banks didn't care because land values were rising. The government didn't care because Seibu employed thousands of people and paid enormous taxes on those paper profits. Shareholders didn't care because Seibu's stock price kept climbing. Yoshiaki cultivated an image as a humble, hard-working billionaire who slept in his office and avoided publicity. He rarely gave interviews. He dressed modestly. He preached discipline and old-fashioned Japanese values. The media loved him. He was proof that you could be a capitalist and still honor traditional culture. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Seibu Group was cooking its books so aggressively that its accounting department had accounting departments. But every Ponzi scheme has an expiration date, and Yoshiaki Tsutsumi's was about to arrive. Chapter 3. The breaking point: the bubble bursts on December 29, 1989. The Nikkei stock index hit its all-time peak of 38,957. That was the last day of the Japanese miracle. By October 1990, the Nikkei had crashed 48%. By 1992, Japanese land prices began their collapse. By 2003, Tokyo real estate had lost 80% of its peak value. The bubble hadn't just popped, it had disintegrated. For most Japanese companies, this was a disaster. For Yoshiaki Tsutsumi, it was an extinction-level event. Remember, his entire empire was built on inflated land values. When real market prices began declining, the gap between Seibu's claimed values and actual values became impossible to hide. Banks that had happily lent billions against Seibu's properties suddenly wanted proof those properties were actually worth what the balance sheets claimed. They weren't, not even close. A resort property that Seibu valued at $500 million might actually be worth $50 million at current market prices, if you could find a buyer at all. Japan's ski resorts were emptying as the economy tanked. The golf course bubble had burst spectacularly. Courses that sold memberships for $1 million in 1989 couldn't give them away in 1995. Seibu's luxury hotels were hemorrhaging cash as corporate expense accounts vanished and tourism collapsed. Yoshiaki tried everything to keep the illusion alive. He sold assets at fire sale prices to generate cash, then claimed on his books that he'd sold them for far more. He created even more circular transactions to generate phantom profits. He borrowed from one Seibu subsidiary to pay back another. He personally guaranteed loans, pledging land that was already pledged 3 times over. But the math was impossible. If your assets aren't worth what you claim, and you've borrowed against those inflated values, you don't just have a valuation problem. You have a solvency problem. By the late 1990s, Seibu Group was functionally bankrupt, kept alive only by banks too afraid to pull the plug because it would expose their own bad loans. For over a decade, Yoshiaki Tsutsumi played an increasingly desperate game of financial hide-and-seek. And he might have died before getting caught, except he made one critical mistake. He tried to cheat the stock market. Chapter 4. The House of Cards collapses in the early 2000s. Japanese regulators were finally cracking down on corporate fraud after decades of looking the other way. The Enron scandal in America had made financial transparency a global concern. And investigators had started noticing something very suspicious about Seibu Railway Company, the crown jewel of Tsutsumi's empire. The problem was simple. Seibu Railway's shareholder registry didn't make sense. Japanese law required publicly traded companies to disclose shareholders who owned more than 5% of the company. Seibu Railway's official registry showed dozens of tiny shareholders, none exceeding the 5% threshold. But investigators suspected something. Many of these shareholders didn't exist, were dead, or were front companies controlled by Yoshiaki himself. Why did this matter? Because if Yoshiaki secretly controlled more than 50% of the company through these phantom shareholders, he was violating securities laws and avoiding massive taxes on his actual ownership. In January 2005, prosecutors raided Seibu Group headquarters. What they found was breathtaking. Over 30 years, Yoshiaki Tsutsumi had created an elaborate web of fake shareholders, nominee holders, and shell companies that disguised his true ownership. He had falsified shareholder records submitted to regulators for 3 decades. He had manipulated Seibu Railway's stock price by controlling the supply of shares available to the public. And most damningly, the land values that had made him the richest man in the world were fraudulent from the beginning. The numbers were staggering. Prosecutors estimated that Seibu Group's actual land values were less than 20% of the claimed $468 billion. Assets that existed only on paper accounted for roughly $374 billion of phantom wealth. The man Forbes had called the world's richest was potentially not even a billionaire. In March 2005, Yoshiaki Tsutsumi resigned as chairman of Seibu Railway. In April, he was arrested. In October 2005, he was indicted on charges of falsifying securities reports and violating financial laws. The Prince of Seibu, the symbol of Japan's economic miracle, was led into court in handcuffs. Seibu Railway's stock was delisted from the Tokyo Stock Exchange, a humiliating exile that wiped out billions in shareholder value. Seibu Group was forced to sell the Seibu Lions baseball team, iconic hotels, and vast land holdings to pay debts. Major Japanese banks wrote off hundreds of billions in loans. Thousands of employees lost their jobs. But here's the most shocking part. Yoshiaki Tsutsumi received only 30 months in prison, suspended to probation. He never spent a single night in jail. He paid fines of less than $5 million. And when asked about his decades of fraud, he offered a statement that perfectly captured his worldview. "I never thought I was doing anything wrong. This is just how business was done." And you know what? He was right. Chapter 5. Japan's Lost Decades. When Yoshiaki Tsutsumi's empire collapsed, it revealed an uncomfortable truth that Japan is still grappling with today. He wasn't a rogue criminal. He was just the most successful practitioner of a system that rewarded fraud. Throughout the 1980s bubble, hundreds of Japanese companies inflated asset values, created circular transactions, borrowed recklessly against fake collateral, and bribed officials to maintain the illusion of perpetual growth. Banks lent money to borrowers they knew couldn't repay, confident that rising asset prices would solve everything. Regulators ignored red flags because economic growth was the national religion. Politicians accepted donations from companies they were supposed to regulate. The Tsutsumi scandal was just the most visible example of a systemic rot. When the bubble burst, Japan entered what economists call the lost decades, 30 years of economic stagnation, deflation, and disappointment. The Nikkei stock index peaked in 1989 at 38,957. As of 2024, it still hasn't consistently surpassed that level. An entire generation of Japanese investors lost their retirement savings. Young people graduated into an economy with no jobs. Birth rates collapsed. Innovative companies were starved of capital, while zombie banks kept fraudulent companies on life support to avoid recognizing their losses. And the saddest part? Many of the structural problems that enabled Tsutsumi's fraud remain unfixed. Japanese corporate governance is still weak. Cross-shareholding arrangements still allow companies to hide problems. Land values and balance sheets are still not marked to market. The cozy relationships between politicians, regulators, and big business persist. Yoshiaki Tsutsumi himself faded into obscurity. He gave up control of Seibu Group, paid his fines, and disappeared from public life. Reports suggest he lives quietly in Tokyo, an elderly man who once ruled an empire worth $500 billion and now controls nothing. The Seibu Railway continues to operate. It was eventually bailed out and restructured. The Prince Hotel chain still exists, now owned by a Singaporean sovereign wealth fund. The Seibu Lions baseball team plays under different ownership. The pieces of the empire survived, but the empire itself and the myth it represented died in 2005. In 2020, Yoshiaki's rival half-brother Seiji passed away at age 86. Seiji had built his portion of the inheritance, Seibu department stores, into a successful, legitimate retail empire without fraud or scandal. The contrast between the brothers' legacies is perfect. One chose sustainable business, the other chose fraud. One retired with reputation intact, the other in disgrace. But here's the question we need to ask. In an economic system that rewarded Yoshiaki's behavior for 30 years and punished him with probation and small fines when caught, who really learned the lesson? Chapter 6. When fraud becomes culture, so what can we learn from the rise and fall of Yoshiaki Tsutsumi? First, understand that asset bubbles don't just create bad investments, they create moral hazards. When everyone believes prices will rise forever, fraud becomes rational. Why value your land honestly when dishonesty is profitable and everyone else is doing it? Yoshiaki didn't wake up one day and decide to commit $468 billion in fraud. He took small steps that were rewarded, so he took bigger steps and bigger ones until he couldn't turn back even if he wanted to. Second, recognize that fraud is rarely a one-person operation. Yoshiaki couldn't have pulled this off alone. He needed bankers who didn't ask questions, accountants who fudged the numbers, politicians who changed regulations in his favor, regulators who looked the other way, and a media that celebrated him instead of investigating him. When an entire system is incentivized to maintain a lie, that lie becomes very hard to expose. This is why whistleblowers are so rare. It's not just about exposing one bad actor. It's about challenging an entire ecosystem that benefits from the fraud continuing. Third, watch for the warning signs. In Japan's case, they were everywhere. Prices detaching from fundamentals, debt growing faster than income, accounting rules that allowed companies to value assets however they wanted, regulators captured by the industries they regulated, and skeptics dismissed as pessimists who didn't understand the new economy. Fourth, understand that the aftermath of fraud is always longer and more painful than the bubble itself. Japan's bubble lasted roughly a decade. The consequences lasted 3 decades and counting. A generation of Japanese who grew up during the boom years has spent their entire adult lives in stagnation. The social costs, delayed marriages, fewer children, mental health crises, lost confidence, can't be measured in dollars, but are just as real as the financial losses. When you hear economists or politicians dismissing bubbles as creative destruction or saying the market will sort itself out, remember that real people pay the price for other people's fraud. Finally, and most importantly, learn to question authority. Forbes magazine declared Yoshiaki Tsutsumi the richest man in the world because they trusted his financial statements. Japanese regulators approved his company's public listing because everyone did it that way. Banks lent him billions because everyone believed Japanese land was priceless. Investors bought his stock because experts said it was safe. Everyone was wrong. The world's greatest frauds succeed not because they're sophisticated, but because people assume someone else has checked the numbers. Enron was audited by Arthur Andersen, one of the world's most prestigious accounting firms. Bernie Madoff was investigated by the SEC multiple times and cleared. Theranos had board members like Henry Kissinger and George Shultz. Trust, but verify. Always verify. Yoshiaki Tsutsumi fooled the entire world for 30 years because the world wanted to be fooled. Japan's economic miracle was a great story, and he was the perfect protagonist. When reality became inconvenient, everyone chose the story instead. The train tycoon built his empire on lies because lies were more profitable than truth. But eventually, reality catches up. It always does. The only question is how much damage occurs before it happens. If stories like this, where we uncover the economic events that shaped our world while most people weren't paying attention, fascinate you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, because we're just getting started with these financial educational mysteries.